Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the weekly web show for student affairs professionals in higher education. I'm your host, Heather Shea Gasser from Michigan State University, and today I'm talking with a panel about supporting first-generation and low-income students to increase access and achievement on campus. Before we get on with the show, I needed to give a quick shout out to our show's sponsors. Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Ed Live network, where free live webcasts allow viewers to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in student affairs. You can tune in to Student Affairs Live with my incredible co-host Tony Duty and me this fall every other Wednesday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. You can join our conversation today on Twitter by using the Higher Ed Live hashtag. Thanks so much to Rob and Denise for stepping in at the last minute and helping me monitor our back channel today. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Join M. Stoner strategist Fran Zablocki for a three-part webinar series on higher ed information architecture. IA is critical to anyone who works with their institution and wants to help connect with visitors on the web. The better your site's IA, the easier it is for visitors to find information and engage with your institution. We're tweeting out a link now where you can learn more about the series and register. Student Affairs Live is also exclusively sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. ACPA's strategic partnership with Higher Ed Live calls attention to the pairing of innovative professional development delivery with the strength of a renowned professional association. ACPA publishes the Journal of College Student Development and About Campus and has recently launched a new content delivery platform, ACPA Video on Demand. Check it out today at videos.myacpa.org. Now on with the show. So I'm grateful to engage in a two-part, two-week series here on Student Affairs Live about supporting the success of low-income and first-generation college students. Today here at Michigan State University, it's our first day of classes. We are welcoming an incoming cohort of nearly 8,000 new students to campus. I wonder what their experience will be like. How will we as a campus recognize and support the unique strengths of low-income and first-generation students? And how can we work with them to best meet their needs as they transition and matriculate this fall? So on today's show, 4 individuals are joining me for this conversation. Dr. Amy Martin also works here at Michigan State University and is directly involved with answering the questions that I just posed as our Associate Director for Neighborhood Student Success. And she's also serving as the University Innovation Alliance, or UIA, Fellow for MSU. Tricia Brand is the Associate Dean for Student Development at Portland Community College and has a background working with TRIO programs. Dr. Judy Marquez Kiyama is a faculty member in the Higher Education Department at the University of Denver and studies FirstGen and low-income student success and family support. And finally, Yolanda Norman is the founder and Chief Executive Officer of FirstGen College Consulting and has over a decade of experience working with student transition in both K-12 and higher ed. Yolanda also recently launched a YouTube video series called You Belong, the hashtag that we borrowed for today's show. So we're tweeting out a link now with more detail on all of our participants, and I want to thank all of you for being here today on Student Affairs Live. All right, so let's begin. So I want to have each of you start by giving a bit of context to our viewers about your passion for serving and working with low-income and first-generation students. How did you come to this work, and share any relevant background or information that keeps you going in this role? So we'll start with Amy. Don't forget to unmute.
Where the hell?
There you go.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be here and a part of this great panel of people looking at FirstGen and low-income students and their success. I came through this work through many years working in resident life. So my work, both in terms of direct contact with students, but also working on programs and initiatives to help them be successful. And particularly at the University of Maryland, I was working with many living learning programs, very strong living learning programs that we knew were having great impact on students there. but also recognizing that there were students that we weren't serving through those high impact programs like living learning programs. So I was very interested in learning how to serve those students. We started creating a program called SingQuest there to try to meet their needs, and that immersed me in, you know, working with other people across campus and looking at the literature and research, and also talking to students, of course. I also, in my doctoral program, worked with many colleagues who were looking at students' transition to college and what could help them be successful. So I've been around a lot of people who are really interested in this topic. And I came to Michigan State University, honestly, because of the Neighborhoods program here and the ways in which Michigan State has designed itself to be accessible to students, to have centers out where students are living that makes it easy for them to access service and resources. And in addition, Michigan State is really looking at the experiences of FirstGen and low-income students here and how we can better serve them. So that brings my interest. I keep going and doing this work because of my engagement with students and watching either our coaches interacting with students who are coming to college or interacting with students myself and seeing the tangible difference that our support and interaction provides them and helps them to be successful.
Great. Thanks so much, Amy. Thanks for being here today. Yolanda, tell us a little bit about you.
Heather, thanks again for having me. I sincerely appreciate it. I was a first-generation low-income college student, so this work is very personal to me because I've had the opportunity to live the experience, and I'm continuing to live that experience as a first-generation college graduate. I also got my start in residence life, so that's exciting to have another res lifer on here. A couple of years ago at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, I was walking through the residence hall as the director of residence life and overheard some students speaking about dropping out of college. Well, as nosy as I was and as concerned as I was, I stopped and talked with the students. And at that moment, I learned that just talking with students and helping them to understand as a professional, being a first-generation college graduate, it's important to tell them that and to help them to see something in their future that they might not see today. With that meeting and several meetings later, I actually started the first-generation college student group and initiative at the university. And that just threw me into a whole other world of these students need an advocate and these students need someone who really does understand what they're going through. And it took off, you know, and really understanding what we can do to impact a university, impact a city, and taking that on into a school district going through K and 12. So here I sit today with a consulting company dedicated to my first generation college students and their success, and really giving these students a voice because the population, as we're going to talk about today, is so different, so diverse. Each of these students needs to be able to understand that they can be successful and that their voice is so important in helping colleges and universities and our nation to be able to understand who they are and how they can be successful. So I'm really excited to lend the experience that I have had and learn from this great panel that you've gathered here today.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it so much. Tricia, welcome.
There we go. Thank you. So it's really great hearing everybody's stories. And again, Heather, thanks for including me in this panel. You know, my background's a little different. My background is in educational psychology, and I actually made a transition into supporting college students from working in early education. I always had a passion for wanting to serve and support and champion underserved communities. And so my focus had been at the time on looking at kindergarten readiness with some of the poorest school districts in New Jersey. And I was training a lot of college students, particularly college students coming from the very same communities, going into those communities to evaluate students and to help create some social capital with parents and with the communities. And in my conversations with those college students, I really found that it was extremely valuable for me to be thinking about how to support their own success, because in many cases these were first-generation college students who were being seen by their families and their communities as sort of the bridge to social mobility, economic mobility, opportunities for continuing to enhance the community. And so I made a transition from basically early education policy to working directly with college students and primarily focusing on first-generation low-income students. Started in New Jersey, Rutgers Newark, as well as Rutgers in the New Brunswick area, and then made the transition to the University of Arizona, where I was the director for student support services for a couple of years, and continue to do that work in the leadership role in terms of being an associate dean at a small private liberal arts college, and now I'm here at Portland Community College, and where I'm really immersed in this work. And all of those areas have been really, really valuable to help me think about ways in which we can help set the tone from both policy, practice, and service to those who are most in need and sometimes most underserved in the higher education spectrum.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tricia.
Yeah.
Judy, tell us a little bit about your path.
Sure. So mine is kind of two parts, I guess. One thing that Tricia and Heather didn't mention is that the three of us all work together at the University of Arizona in multicultural affairs undergraduate initiatives. And so before I transitioned into my faculty role, I, with Heather and Tricia, worked with retention initiatives for first-generation low-income and students of color, everything from summer bridge transition programs through first-year retention initiatives, and Tricia oversaw the TRIO programs. And so we made a great team, I think, in serving these students. And for me, it was also very personal. Like Yolanda, I am a first-generation college student, and so it was nice to be able to then oversee and work with these programs that I had gone through as a student myself. I was a student in this summer bridge program. I was a student in student support services, and understand from personal experiences what that means and what it's like to navigate a campus when it's completely new to you. When I transitioned into faculty life, my research agenda still focuses on these issues. And so while I do a lot of work with Latino students and families and communities, these students often come from first-generation backgrounds, low-income backgrounds, working-class backgrounds, and face much of the same issues that we'll talk about today. And so my work looks at what are the success factors for these students as they transition into and through higher education? How can we understand their experiences and the systems that often create and shape these experiences from an asset lens versus a deficit perspective, where we're constantly saying, you as the student or you as the family member need to take sole responsibility, or it's your fault that you're not successful. And so we know that there are a lot of resources and various cultural knowledges present within these families and communities, and we know that they are offering support to students in maybe ways that are not as traditional as we typically see and read about. I hope that's one of the things we can talk about today is how can we as institutions better serve these students by understanding the diverse practices and resources found within these families and communities.
That's great.
Most definitely, yeah. They cannot be separated for sure.
Yeah.
We have used, Judy, the two terms, first generation and low income, together in the title of the show, but we know that they're not synonymous, and yet many campuses group services together under these two different populations. Can you talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between students from either group?
Sure. I mean, I think it's important just to offer some definitions to start with. I think we're all probably operating from some common definitions, but I think we generally think about first-generation students as the first in their family to go to college, but different people have defined it differently, right, across research and scholarship. So some have said, well, it's neither parent has more than a high school education. I think the commonly accepted definition is that neither parent graduated with a bachelor's degree. And first-generation students can be low income, but they're not always low income. So the Pell Institute issued a report that stated that low-income status is defined as having a household income of under $25,000 per year, and that first-generation status is defined by having either parent earned a bachelor's degree. But Tricia, correct me if I'm wrong, federal TRIO programs can determine low-income eligibility for their families or for their students based on the states the students are in and the number of people in the family unit, right? The size of the family unit.
Absolutely. Yes.
So this definition of low income can shift if we're looking at program requirements or even institutions determining the level of need-based aid that they're going to offer. So they may move those income levels depending on who they're targeting and what they can offer.
Great. So Tricia, in terms of common needs that these two populations have in terms of campus services, talk a little bit about those overlaps and how campus offices can often address and meet these needs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of what is really quite relevant even here at Portland Community College is that oftentimes we're talking with students about how they're going to make a plan, an academic plan and a career plan. Part of what's also being discussed is this idea of how the career plan is going to support the ability to not only be successful at the college level, but also to support the family. And within that idea of supporting the family, there's usually a need to start supporting right away. So it's this idea of like, how can I be successful at school? How can I also pay for college? And how can I pay for other things that I need to be handling while I am a student? And so the services that we provide at the college level really needs to integrate all those pieces of the student experience. There are several studies that are out that demonstrate that at least 50% of undergraduate students need to work while they are in school. Many of those students happen to be low-income students. Many of those students happen to be first-generation students. So the question is, how do they integrate and balance those particular needs while they're also trying to begin to develop their identity as a student, possibly become involved while they're at their college campuses? So maybe they're involved in leadership, maybe they really wanted to do some additional academic work that helps them begin to kind of set the path for research opportunities. So how do we structure those services to help them think about how to integrate those aspects of who they are? And how do we help them think about the most successful habits to integrate those pieces? So that's where I see where services are really critical, is thinking about all of those particular competing kind of roles and responsibilities and identities for a student and how you navigate that, especially in the first 2 years of college.
That's great. And I think that's a great discussion about the models that are present on our campuses. And for folks who are watching today and thinking about how they're serving, looking at what their offices are providing, that's a great overview. Thanks, Tricia. Mm-hmm. So Amy, talk to me about what do we know about our numbers of low-income students on campus. And we've talked about Pell eligibility and other indicators. But what else should we be looking at to help identify students? And what about those students who aren't completing FAFSA forms, financial aid documentation forms, like undocumented students? Talk a little bit about that broadly and maybe specifically at MSU.
Sure. So I'll start with what we've been talking about as UIA institutions, so some of the large numbers. So if you look at the 11 UIA institutions, there are 378,489 undergraduate students at those 11 institutions. And of those students, 119,384 are Pell Grant students. So it's about 33% of students at those institutions who are Pell eligible. So one of the impetus behind the UIA institutions coming together is this large number of students that we're serving through our institutions. At MSU, what that looks like is we have 38,700 plus undergraduate students. We have about 8,000 students coming in this year, and that's a little bit higher than other years, but pretty typical. And of those students, we have almost 1,000 first-generation students. We have about 250 Pell eligible students, and of those, 840 are both first-gen and Pell eligible. So those are the things that we've been looking at when we're developing programs and outreach here to those students. And I think the question about other factors to identify is really important, and it's something that we've been exploring on our campus. So this year, for example, we started looking at our Spartan Advantage students. There's about 600 Spartan Advantage students on campus who are receiving scholarships to come to campus and aid. And when we pulled those numbers into the groups that we were looking at, we added an additional 200 students into the set of students that we're providing outreach to. So I think that was another way that we looked at the identity of these students, and then also looking at things like developmental courses. So students who might be in those courses that are helping them get to the courses for their major. Also looking again, you know, as others have talked about, other campus organizations or programs that are out there. We partner very closely with our TRIO program and our CAMP program, which is a migrant student program. And so we ask them to help us in identifying students as well. And I think the last thing is, I think analytics and some of the technology that's out there now can help us to better identify students who might not fall into some of these categories and yet need our outreach. So that's what I would say in summary.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those technology pieces that can enhance our ability to understand our student populations a little bit later on in the show. So in terms of definitions, one of the things that really struck me, Yolanda, as I was watching your You Belong YouTube video is how complex it is for a student to understand how their own campus is defining first generation specifically, since that has variability across the universities and colleges. How do you define it? And should we try to solicit or advocate for a common definition? And then what do we know about the numbers? So I'll give you all of those questions. You tell me which one to go with.
I absolutely think that we should define it and have a minimum definition. So I define it similar to what we've already talked about today, with neither the mother nor the father has a bachelor's degree. And I think, again, I use the word minimum intentionally because I think depending on your campuses, some universities actually like to enhance that definition. So they might throw in about adopted parents information. They might throw in about graduating from another country into that definition. But as a minimum, I think that we owe it to our students to be able to have the one that talks about neither the mother nor the father has a bachelor's degree. And I strongly believe that you have to have that minimum definition, and we as colleges and universities should adopt it because we have to identify our students. If we're planning programs for our students, we're looking for support services for them, we're talking about different ways that we can evaluate those programs, how can we effectively really support these students if we don't know how to identify the students, and the students don't know how to identify themselves, right? So we have an opportunity to be able to help our campuses, from our faculty to our staff members to our students, to find this absolute definition for them, and then be able to go through the process of starting to evaluate and starting to look at who are these services supporting. As we're going through that, and I think that that's the big thing about what are the numbers out there. Because students have to actually identify themselves, right? On our college applications, sometimes this question about the highest level of degree attainment for your parents, it's optional. So students have to really think about self-identification. And so the numbers are skewed because, one, we have multiple definitions on a campus. So one, maybe your education department, let's say one campus, their education department says, here's the definition. Well, the retention committee could have a completely different definition, as well as the TRIO department could have a different definition as well. So thinking about those students, think about that freshman student. I don't know who I am. I don't understand this identity because I have different areas on the campus. that are telling me what a first-generation college student is. So I think we absolutely owe it to these students. I didn't find out I was a first-generation college student until my junior year. I wish I would have known, because I probably would have benefited from a lot of the support that was on campus. But my uniqueness was I was also a student athlete. And that's a whole other situation where student athletes have one sense of belonging, but I felt a different type of sense of belonging when it came to inside the classroom itself. So yes, there are numbers out there about students from the Pell Institute, as well as different numbers on college campuses. But I don't think we're at a place right now, because we as a country have not adopted an official definition to where we can say how many first-generation college students are currently on our campuses.
Okay, great. Thank you for giving us that. I mean, I think this is why we want to have episodes like this. So we have folks who are watching today who can maybe start thinking about how this plays out on their campus, and then work towards some policy issues as well.
Heather, can I jump in for one
sure.
quick second? So everything that we've talked about thus far is complicated, right? We don't know. Sometimes institutions don't even ask about first-generation status on applications. If students don't understand what that term means, then self-identifying is even more difficult. But I think one of the reasons this conversation is so important, and that the services that are being developed are so important, is because we know that low-income and first-generation students have higher rates of leaving during their first year, and have lower rates of sixth-year completion rates for their bachelor's degree. And really pertinent for Tricia and community colleges is we know a lot of them start at two-year institutions or proprietary institutions even. And so focusing on what those resources can be for those students, especially in that critical transition point, is key.
Yeah, that is really the crux of the issue. And as campuses are looking at retention, and that's a driver for all kinds of initiatives, that's really the factor that we're talking about. And so what influences that? And I think a piece of it that we've talked a lot about at Michigan State, and I know you and I and Tricia used to talk a lot about as well at the University of Arizona, is about helping students identify, but also increasing help-seeking behaviors, increasing capacity for asking for help. Tricia, talk about this. When you were working at Arizona, but also in your current role, how do you work with incoming students to develop those help-seeking behaviors that are your critical components to student success, so that they also are partners in their responsibility for gaining those services?
Yeah, it's an ongoing, to some extent it requires ongoing engagement and I think innovative thinking around how to engage students connected to this. And I think about it from two perspectives. This is going to build off what Judy just added as a comment, and also what Yolanda was talking about in terms of the challenges of self-identification of what it means to be a first-generation college student, and the ways in which, in many ways, there's this framework of like, I'm a college student, and so I'm supposed to already have figured it out. Whether or not you're starting at a two-year institution, you're at a four-year institution, or even if you're at a private institution, much like I was at Lewis and Clark, where we had a lot of students who were honestly some of the best performers in their high schools, making a transition to a four-year or a two-year institution, and having to sort of start at a place of having to unlearn some things and relearn some things, or learn for the first time. And I think that that's the part of the challenge, is that for everybody, including for families who really would like to support their student as they're making this transition, there is this belief that whatever is going to create success for you as a student, it's something that you were already born with. You already possess these qualities. You're going to be successful. It's not about the fact that there needs to be a framework to be engaged to figure out how to do college successfully. There is sort of this framework of how to college. And so there's this quiet conversation that happens for students who've had parents who've gone to college, or even older siblings, or there's a culture of college within a community. When you haven't had that culture of college, this framework of the fact that you should be utilizing resources at your university or at your college is completely new. And so it feels like it's a form of weakness. It feels like it's a frame of failure. And so we have to constantly be creative and innovative about how to engage it. And I think it has to be an early conversation. And it's around this idea that you kind of socially norm it. This is what successful college students do. And it's also very normal for you to have some challenges, for you not to be successful 100% of the time. And that's when it's time to start thinking about ways in which you navigate and balance those challenges. So I think it's just about making sure there are those early conversations and really creating sort of this social norming about the fact that college is not something that you're just naturally successful around. You have to work at it, and there are resources that want to support you.
Awesome. We talk about this all the time in my program because we offer free tutoring services, and we wonder why students who aren't doing well aren't accessing our tutoring, and I think it comes from that perception that asking for help often is admitting some kind of failure. And so helping students realize that that is a totally normal thing to do. Every student who is trying to be successful is accessing those services is great. But deficit-based perspectives, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, kind of limit our belief about the potential success for first-generation students. And our campuses sometimes are full of those deficit-based perspectives. Amy, can you talk a little bit about how we can look instead at strengths, and what are the strengths that FirstGen and low-income students bring to our campuses?
I think this is a really rich part of the conversation, right? Because what Trisha's talking about is how do we talk with students about the realities of transition to college and what they'll need to do to be successful, but also what I would call change the meta-narrative on campus about students who are coming. And we need to do that in order for students to overall feel like they belong here, that we want them here and we want them to be successful. So some examples of some ways I've heard us trying to change that narrative, both at MSU and in the UIA, is thinking about terms like at risk, and what does that really mean versus differently prepared, or coming in with different experiences. One of the UIA visits, we went and visited Georgia State University, and I really appreciated their president, Mark Becker, kind of talking about this narrative of we're not going to be proud of who we enrolled on our campus, what their SAT or ACT score was, or how high their GPA was, but we're going to be known for the number of students who graduate and who are successful. So that's a big narrative to change in terms of a campus responsibility for graduating students. I think other things that we can think about are changing language from things like remedial courses to developmental courses on a campus that are helping students take that next step. Instead of talking about performance gaps, talking about outcome gaps, outcomes in graduation rates and persistence rates. And it puts the onus back on us as the institution that these are gaps that exist on our campus but aren't necessarily the responsibility of the student, that somehow they are lacking in some way. I think the other thing that we can try to do in this area is normalize services. So we were talking about how this is what anyone who is going to be successful at college, how they navigate the environment. So some good examples of that, at ASU, they have a coaching program for every incoming student. So instead of targeting their coaching and mentoring programs to specific groups that they believe are at risk, they're normalizing the coaching behavior. Every student who comes in should have a coach. This is part of how you navigate the campus. And so there are ways that we can normalize those experiences, even in the classroom. So at UT Austin, there's a real faculty movement there to look at why do we feel we need to weed students out of courses? Why couldn't all of our students be successful? And how are we teaching and creating curriculums that tend to students' learning styles and the ways that they go about learning? So I think it's switching this narrative to put more of the onus on us.
That's great. I think the language piece is absolutely critical. We had a great question from Twitter, so I want to make sure that folks who are watching today know that they can tweet questions for our panelists to the hashtag HireLive. Robin is watching that Twitter feed and helping us get those questions. So Kathy Adams-Reister asked a question about how we can support families of first-generation students, and that really ties directly to my next question. So I'm going to do a kind of a combo here. Judy, you've been studying this in your scholarly research, and we know that family understanding and support is really critical to student success. Can you talk a little bit about how campuses can work to bridge that gap sometimes between students and parents and families in general?
Yeah, I'm excited by the question. This is the crux of where my research is at right now, and it's in partnership with Cassandra Harper at the University of Missouri. And we have been visiting various orientation programs and sitting in as observers to understand how are institutions communicating with diverse families, low-income families, first-generation families, families of color, what messages are being sent, what institutional responsibility is being communicated with respect to welcoming and engaging these families on campus, and at the same time following families during their first year to understand how they're interpreting those messages and experiencing that first year of transition. I think some of the simplest things can be, let's lose these ridiculous metaphors and terminologies around helicopter parents and placing parents within certain categories. And even the term parents is not inclusive, right? I mean, we know that families are very diverse. We know that some are coming from single household families, some are coming from same-sex families, some are coming from foster families. And so to just solely say parents doesn't always capture the complexity, really, that these students are bringing with them. And one institution in particular referred to folks as support members versus parents. So when we think of terms like helicopter parenting and what that I don't know, the pictures that we create in our heads about that, about hovering and parents making all these decisions for their kids, it often is representing a certain subset of parents who maybe have a little bit more information about college, who went to college themselves, who are higher income, often white. So it doesn't encompass the experiences of these families that we're talking about, and it paints all of these parents in very negative ways, family members. Equally problematic are these metaphors around first-generation families. There was an article last year that came out that said these families are just watching their kids from a space station, not engaged, not knowing how to be engaged, not interested, and all of these we know are false assumptions. We know that the engagement might look different, but we know there's a lot of collective and community resources that are supporting students. And so making sure that the language we use during orientation is inclusive, making sure we don't say things like, well, when you went to college, remember X, Y, and Z. Some institutions are starting to offer sessions during orientation for first-generation families and low-income families. The challenge is that sometimes it's often the multicultural affairs offices or the diversity affairs offices that are being asked to do this work. And so I think institutionally it needs to be embedded into the fabric and the culture of the institution, that the whole institution needs to support these families. But everything from early academic outreach to programming during orientation sessions to we're seeing the growth in parent and family initiatives throughout the academic year. Those are all wonderful ways to support these families, and in thinking about different ways to do it. So using social media, going to these families when appropriate and when that's available, rather than always asking them to come on campus, I think can be effective strategies to engaging them.
Great. I can't wait to see all of your outcomes from your research. That's going to be fabulous. And I think changing that narrative is really important. There's a fabulous article from the New York Times that you alerted us to that I think Robin is tweeting out for folks, which I think reframes that perspective and talks a little bit about what it's like to move in and have your parents be a part of that process as well.
Can I add something really, really quickly? So Judy, I'm so excited to hear about the research that you're doing around orientations. It's interesting because at the community college level, we're talking a little bit more about what we can be doing to, number one, make orientation mandatory for all students, because we don't have mandatory orientation for all students at some of our colleges and universities. But this piece around families or support members who can be a part of orientation versus those who cannot, and for those who are not a part of orientation, what are we doing at our colleges and universities to still make sure that those support members are getting both the support and the information they need to help their students. There's sort of this expectation that if this is really valuable to your family, then they'll be there, and not really taking into account all of the challenges that come with a family being able to send a student off to college. So that's another critical piece that I think is important, and something we had to work really hard around at a liberal arts institution to say, we've got about a third of our families who can't be here for orientation and take 3 days and spend, and basically stay in a fancy hotel in Portland, Oregon, right? So how do we structure things to still be able to get content to those support members, even if they can't be a part of all of kind of the pomp and circumstance and the excitement of orientation? So
yeah, I think that's a whole nother dimension, and we're going to talk a little bit about community colleges specifically, I think, more with Tricia's perspectives. Thanks. So I want to get to this crux of this question, because we spend a lot of time talking at Arizona about whose responsibility is student success. We have all these programs on our campuses built around helping students be successful. Does responsibility lie with the student, or is it the responsibility of the campus? And this is kind of a very big meta question, but Judy, I'm going to start back with you, and then all of us will answer this one.
So my personal perspective is that the institution must take responsibility. We can't assume that that students come in knowing even the steps to take, right? And so we have the resources on campus. We have hopefully some budgets to do and human resources to better serve students. And so yeah, my perspective is that there's got to be a lot of institutional responsibility. However, that I'm not trying to say that the students don't have any place and role in it. We want to see student initiative, right? We want to see those help-seeking behaviors, that they're using tutoring, they're using those resources. We can create all of the resources and opportunities, but if students don't know that they're there, or don't know that they can and should be using them, then there is a disconnect. But I think it's up to us to reframe even how we go about sharing that information, and not always assuming that students know that the information is there or know that they should walk through our doors. So maybe the outreach and the ways in which we're marketing our resources and programs needs to shift a little bit too.
Great. Yeah. Yolanda?
I absolutely agree with what Judy's saying. It's definitely the priority is the institution. With that secondary priority being the students, I think that we shouldn't also forget the current students that are there, right? Especially to help the incoming first-generation college students. With the experience that I've had within the school district, just seeing how impactful it is for a current first-generation low-income college student to come to a high school and talk to the graduating seniors. How impactful is that? For them to go in and say, here's what you need to do to use your student voice. Here's the resources that are on campus. And if you run into a problem or you run into some type of challenge on campus, here's who you should talk to. Here's my story. Here's who I talked to when I ran into a challenge or a problem. So being able to help the incoming students at orientation is absolutely imperative, so that those students know what to do. But don't forget about your current students that are there, and even your alum that are there as well, and making sure that they take on that effect. Because again, when you think about, for some low-income first-generation college students, it takes a village is a very common type of cultural background. So my neighbor is also knowing what I'm doing. I may be the only kid on that block who's going to college. So our support system, our family system, you're right, is just not our parents. So how can we also get the community involved in that conversation? I'm excited for us when we get to the question to talk about technology and leveraging that, and really helping to bring more into that conversation about how do you use your voice and how do you take that responsibility, everyone take that responsibility of supporting these students on towards graduation.
Yeah, I completely agree. Peer mentoring, and many of us know that has a direct impact on the students who are being mentored, but also on the mentors themselves. Gain a lot from that experience. Amy, what is your perspective on this question?
Well, I was thinking about if we think about everyone's job being student success, which our provost and vice president of student affairs have pretty much told us on campus, it's everyone's job, so everyone should be considering this. But if we look through that lens at the student experience, it can really change the way that we think about our processes and how things are navigated on campus. So, for example, we looked at mapping here. We met with about 30 different units on campus who all have communications with incoming students. And when you start to map out what that looks like from the student perspective, you understand how inundated they are with messages. So everyone has, the right perspective in terms of wanting to reach students and give them good information. But if that's not in a way that they can digest with everything coming at them, it's not helpful to them. So I think in terms of everyone's job being student success, it's looking at your services, your processes, your policies from the student perspective and what they're experiencing.
Awesome. Tricia.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly. I think that what we're discussing creates sort of this interesting conflict a little bit in terms of thinking about how our educational system has been structured for many, many years. And let's think about the fact that in the classroom, we can say that it's the institution's responsibility, but in the classroom, every faculty member expects that every individual student is responsible for their success in the classroom. So it's this idea of how do you really balance this framework and make sure that there's the opportunity for all members of our community to recognize that they have a role in being able to set very clear guidelines and expectations, but also to recognize that it's really our responsibility to see every student get to the finish line. And so I think that that's part of what we have to navigate, is knowing that we also have that other value system in place at our colleges and universities, which is that every individual student has to figure out how to make this successful experience for themselves. So how do we balance that for our students and help them recognize that it's about a shared conversation around expectations?
That's a really good point. So, Tricia, you talked briefly a little bit about TRIO, and I think having this conversation, we can't really have this conversation without recognizing the fact that TRIO programs have for 40+ years supported student success, and yet they're limited, right, to a specific population, and resources are limited, funding is limited. Can you talk a little bit about how some of the best practices in TRIO can reach other areas of campus, and maybe what some of those best practices are?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for giving a little bit of a highlight and a spotlight to TRIO programs who have been doing this work for a very long time. And I'll also do a shout out quickly to community colleges who've also been doing this work. It's kind of part of their mission from the very beginning. And the fact that resources are quite limited. And so what do you end up doing when there's always this framework of, well, you do a great job with TRIO, but it costs so much per student. We can't possibly find a way to replicate or scale up the kinds of efforts that are happening with such a small program that is designed to help support students who might be the most vulnerable to being successful at a college or university. I think there are some things that are scalable, and there are things that a lot of programs are doing at the 4-year college level, 2-year college level. A couple of those to me that are really critical, of course, is early engagement. Judy talked earlier and, of course, was very successful in being able to help continue the tradition of a wonderful summer bridge program at the University of Arizona, the New Start program, which has really always been a gold standard around early engagement and helping students figure out ways in which they can be supportive. And I think that most institutions can do that. Creating a sense of belonging and also a space for students to feel vulnerable. Again, they're not always going to be happy and successful 100% of the time. So where are those spaces where they can be both vulnerable as well as be able to continue to be engaged as a student? I think the intrusive advising piece is something that more and more colleges and universities are thinking about. How can they scale that up in some critical way where every student is receiving some form of academic and kind of personal advising at least once a year, so they have a chance to kind of check in? And that's connected to the last piece that I think is important, which is just regular goal setting and feedback. You know, when we think about the fact that most college freshmen or most college first-year students think that they're not going to change their major, yet almost 2/3 of them do, the question is, when are they having that follow-up to say, how does my new plan kind of map into what it is that I'm doing? And so we've got to figure out a way that there's going to be regular engagement and goal setting for students, especially for first-generation students, thinking about how they can navigate when what their initial plan was is changing and they're not sure how to engage and map a whole new plan.
Awesome. Amy, I'm moving along quickly because we have so many great questions and I want to get to all of them today, but thank you for sharing that, Tricia. I think those are really the best practices, and I agree. I think they are scalable even at a place like MSU, which brings us to Amy. So you talked and alluded to the University Innovation Alliance, UIA. Can you give us a little bit fuller definition of what that coalition of institutions is and how it was brought together, and how some of the goals of the UIA overlap with this conversation about first generation and low income students?
The goals absolutely overlap with everything that we've been talking about. So the universities have come together. This is just a project that's been underway for a little over a year now. Started with a couple large public research institutions, and through conversations among presidents and the UIA kind of came together to look at graduating particularly low-income, traditionally underserved students across the 11 institutions. And really the major concept is that if we would better collaborate to understand what's working and not working on our campuses, that the win would be for students. And the goal is to try to create this really non-competitive environment where institutions are sharing not only things that are working, but the things that they've done along the way to help those projects work. So innovation is really important, but also the ability to scale that up, not only with small groups of students, but across the campus, like the coaching program I mentioned. And then looking at across at different types of programs. So we're looking at analytics and how that can help us in advising, for example. That's one of our first goals. But also looking at socio-emotional support programs, how they help students, looking at early alert systems and programs and how those can better serve students, looking at curriculum design. So all the things that we know are high impact practices, but looking at how they're how they're implemented on a large campus.
Yeah, it's a really innovative new initiative, and I think there's some power, right, in 11 institutions coming together, as a coalition, and maybe there's some funding opportunities, there's some policy influence opportunities, and it's awesome. I mean, we're at Michigan State excited about being a part of it. So cool. Judy, this is a big question too. What is most important to provide? Need or merit-based financial aid?
Okay, so we could do a whole class on this, right?
Yes, we could.
So I think when I think about this question, I think it's important to deconstruct this idea of merit and the ideal of meritocracy before even answering it. I mean, when we think about the assumptions behind meritocracy, and that it's really based on these individualistic endeavors of success, and those with the greatest abilities or talents are the ones that should be recruited and rewarded. But then we know that what goes into merit are things like, well, students have the resources to have SAT prep courses, or students come from high schools that have incredible advanced placement or international baccalaureate courses, or they have families who have gone to college who just have the capital to navigate this system in different ways, to pay for private college counselors or tutors to prep them so that they get the higher scores on whether that's AP tests or SAT tests or higher GPAs that then signal that they should be getting merit aid. So I think I keep using the word complicated, but it is so much more complicated than just saying which one has greater value. So I don't know which one I would pick. I think it's important to really look at what is the need of the students and how can we support these students. And sometimes it's not just through federal aid, but there are institutional grants and opportunities through donations and giving, right, that can support students in different ways that is beyond just a merit-based package.
Yeah, I said
others
that
probably want to answer
as an either or, and
Yeah.
and it is much more complicated than just choosing. Does anyone else have thoughts on this? We agree, Judy.
I have thoughts, but we'll just agree with that and move on. We for the next Higher Ed Live.
Yes, we could have a whole show just on financial aid.
Yes.
Tricia, we had a great question from Twitter about faculty and helping them understand. I think it's based on what you said earlier, and we built this in because I think that link between what faculty do in the classroom is so critical. If you had 1 minute at new employee orientation or faculty orientation to talk about first generation and low income students, what would you say? What would you like educators to understand and think about as far as how they frame their classrooms?
You know, I would really love to have that minute to talk about a couple of narratives, and narratives that are connected to their colleagues who themselves were either first-generation college students or had to kind of chart this path on their own, and for them to understand how difficult it was. Oftentimes when we're on the other side and we've become experts in our field or we're really successful in our careers, we really forget how completely terrifying and challenging and difficult it is to navigate this environment. And I see it happen every single day. We sort of get frustrated. We're like, why didn't this student know how to do this? And it's like, you didn't know how to do that when you were a student. So I think I would really want to spend that time if I could. And I've been doing this lately when I am a part of either a new faculty institute or a part-time faculty institute. Because actually, sometimes that's the most challenging space when you're not a part of a community where you're talking more broadly about the whole student, but you come in and you teach your classes, and then you have to move on wherever else you have to go to teach your classes. So it's this question of like, how do you really integrate them into the community and have them understand both the student narrative, but also probably the narratives of their fellow faculty and students. And so I am always trying to engage any first-generation college faculty member or staff member or dean or president to constantly talk about their experience, and that is a really strong way to get them to understand what that experience is like.
That's a great response. Very good, concise response. All right. Second to the last question, Yolanda, you had experience prior to working in higher ed, or while working in higher ed, also working at the K-12 and district level. Thinking about early education, some of the things that Tricia mentioned earlier, you know, how can we do a better job about some of that early education, exposure to campuses, open houses, pre-enrollment workshops, summer bridge programs, all of those kinds of things. What works and what's been your experience?
Right, so I have a lot of things. Let's see if I can get it in really quickly with what works. So I talked a little bit about making sure that we have our current students go back to their high schools. That's one great way to start educating students. They're giving personal experiences, like Tricia said, personal narratives, so the students are able to identify with another student. It's not just some adult who has no idea what I'm talking about or no idea going through what I'm going through talking to me about a situation. Secondly, getting into community. Right, because we need to be able to see it, the students in these communities. How can we get this information to them? And with enrollment management and admissions, we understand in higher education that you can't go to every community, right? But for the student, that student will sometimes make the assumption, this university is not coming to my community. This university is not seeking me out, therefore it's not for me. So can we find ways to get this information into churches? Can we find ways to get this information into community centers? Can we find ways where it's not just admission and enrollment coming to the school district and coming into our schools? Can we bring in housing directors, the student activities director, the student government association? Can we make this more of a university-wide effort where we are going in and we're talking about we want to support first-generation college students, not just through the application process, but through graduation as well. So just thinking about within the district level, I think that school districts, one, have to ask themselves, who are we speaking with when it comes to the university level? And certainly we're speaking with the president and admissions. but who more can we speak with? I would have loved, as a housing director, to have been wanted by the district to come down and talk with the students. I would have loved that and brought my RAs and everyone from there. So can we find ways to think innovatively and not just the same people coming to the table, but getting others as well to do the same thing? It's so much opportunity for universities to come to districts and do that. They're begging for it, and we just have to find a way to make it happen.
Awesome. I'm going to bring in this technology piece because often that's the place where people first find out about resources, and our students are walking around, you know, with their phones in front of them. And sometimes that's the way they access our resources, but there's also this conversation about the digital divide. Yolanda, do you want to kind of talk about this? You've used technology in a really innovative way with your YouTube series at bringing this knowledge to people where they're at. What should universities and colleges be doing to access that and to create a link?
Absolutely, and a little plug out to FirstGen College TV, You Belong. I hope that you all will join in the conversation. I think we have so many opportunities to use a social media platform, using Twitter and helping students to better understand, first generation students to understand the search engine on Twitter is powerful. You know, for them to be able to connect with a source or another student at another campus in another state is so powerful. And then they will understand that they're not the only student that's feeling that way. Being able to utilize a video service, whether it's YouTube or Vimeo or whatever service that you're using, and helping the student to really come into your home or come into your office. Periscope is a new platform that's happening, and you know, I've been talking with some colleagues about how can we use that during orientation. Tricia talked a little bit about the family unit not being able to travel. How incredible to be able to use Periscope to now broadcast this information to me when my child is 5 hours away, but I can sit in my living room or at the local library and still participate in orientation. Colleges and universities are being very creative with what they're using, and get students involved in that too. You see this on Instagram a lot, where they will actually give the student the Instagram account for the week or for the day, and now these students are starting to see from a student perspective. Have a first generation college student show you their perspective of what it means to be a college student today.
Awesome. That is great. So there was so much to talk about. We didn't get to all of the questions that were on Twitter, and we certainly could go on. And we are continuing this conversation next week with the folks from Lumina. But I wanted to give each of you, just in closing comments, one resource that you would like us to tweet out to the folks who are watching and post on the link related to this topic so they can follow up for additional sources of information. So Amy, I'll start with you. Uh-oh.
There we go.
There you go.
I would say one source that I actually didn't list yet, but that I would have people take a look at in talking about anti-deficit language is the research on stereotype threat and how that influences student behavior in test taking and being successful on campus. So that's Claude Steele's work, and there's been a lot of follow-up work to that. But I think that can be a great start for someone who's looking to understand why language can be so important.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Tricia.
Yeah, I'll just mention very quickly, I know that this went pretty viral for a lot of us at the higher ed level and in student affairs, but I will reiterate, please read the Paul Tuff article through the New York Times also, and the web series at the time the New York Times did about who gets to graduate college. I think it's a really, really valuable, really wonderful integrated kind of narrative that really helps to set the tone. And I also will say, for those who are perhaps community college individuals who are thinking about resources, support research that's happening, to go to Achieving the Dream and have them kind of take a look at what kinds of initiatives have been happening over the last several years and taking a look at outcomes and how they could get involved.
Great. Those are great resources. We're going to get all these links tweeted out. Robin has left me, so I will get them out for those of you who are following the hashtag. Judy, tell us what you'd like to share.
Sure. Okay, so this is going to be a huge self-promotional plug. Cassandra Harper and I have an ASH monograph coming out very soon on parent and family engagement in higher education. And so in it, we review various culturally relevant and culturally inclusive models for engagement, particularly for first-generation, low-income, and families of color. And that hopefully will be out this fall.
Awesome.
Yep.
I can't wait to read it. That is going to be great. All right, Yolanda.
I'm going to continue the shameless plug and just put it out there again about the FirstGen College TV You Belong series. That series was started for first-generation college students and really helping them to understand what it means to belong and encouraging them, and you're right, getting away from this negative talk about they don't belong, and just putting it out there to whatever you can do to support your students, as well as using social media. You know, teach your social media coordinators about how do we connect with students when we see them talking about not belonging and wanting to drop out.
Love it. I think it's a fundamental core of what we do in student affairs is to help students feel like they belong, and I love the hashtag. That's why I asked you if we could use it today. Again, thank you to the four of you. This was a fabulous conversation. I am really looking forward to continuing the dialogue because, as we always know, we never have quite enough time. Next week on Student Affairs Live, 3 folks from the Lumina Foundation, contributors to the new Lumina Foundation guidebook, which is called Beyond Financial Aid, will be joining me for a conversation about how that resource can be used by campuses. And then on September 16th, my colleague Tony Duty will host a show about trends in housing with TJ Logan and Paul Wunenberg, I believe is how you say his last name. You can receive reminders about these and all of the other great shows on Higher Ed Live by subscribing to our newsletter. We also have our archives. You can watch all of our past episodes for free. You can also subscribe to the iTunes podcast, so you can listen to the show while you commute or while you're on the treadmill. Again, I'm Heather Shea Gasser. Thanks again for everyone who watched and contributed to the back channel, and I hope you all have a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.